Chapter 1658. But Xia Mian didn't think so. She hated Yi Muyun. This child's personality was the same as Yi Liangqiu's. Plus, he was brought up by Yi Liangqiu. No matter how good she was to him, he was an ingrate. Just as Xia Mian was about to explode, Crispy Sleeve stopped her. She said sternly, "Xiao Xia, why are you being so calculative with a child?" Crispy Sleeve knew better than Xia Mian. Right now, Xia Mian was nothing. If she really dared to argue with Mu Yun, the consequences would be dire. She probably wouldn't be able to survive in King Entertainment. That wasn't what Crispy Sleeve wanted to see. After her reminder, Xia Mian finally calmed down. She pursed her lips and said softly, "I understand." Then, she put on a gentle look and said gently, "Mu Yun, you've misunderstood. Auntie just wants to help you." Yi Muyun put down the cutlery in his hand and ignored her. Instead, he looked at Crispy Sleeve. "Grandma Crispy, I want to take my afternoon nap. I don't want to be disturbed." Although he was young, he had the air of a young master. It was as if Xia Mian was an outsider. Crispy Sleeve had no choice. She couldn't lose her position in the Qin family for Xia Mian. So, she turned to look at Xia Mian and said pleasantly, "Xiao Xia, why don't you go back first? Next time." Xia Mian was unwilling. How could she leave before President Qin came back? Although Crispy Sleeve looked gentle, she was actually very strong. At least in front of Xia Mian, she was strong. No matter how unwilling Xia Mian was, she could only swallow it and force a smile. "Okay, Aunt Crispy, I'll go back first." She wanted to say goodbye to Mu Yun, but Mu Yun's little face was stiff. Xia Mian was still a little proud, so she couldn't bring herself to do it. In the end, she left first. As soon as she left, Crispy Sleeve hugged Mu Yun and coaxed him. However, no matter how she coaxed, the little guy was still unhappy. Crispy Sleeve looked at his little face. It looked so much like Yi Liangqiu and she couldn't help but sigh. She did not want Mu Yun to lose his mother, but that person was Yi Liangqiu. She could not forgive him. While Mu Yun was taking a nap, Qin Anlin came back with a serious look on his face. Su Xiu had already packed everything and was sitting on the sofa watching TV. Seeing him return, she smiled faintly. "You're back." Qin Anlin nodded and walked over to sit beside Su Xiu. He leaned back and wiped his face. "Aunt Su, don't do this in the future." Crisp Sleeve tilted her head to look at him. "Young master, I can't forget the scene of old Madame's departure." Could it be that young master has forgotten? Qin Anlin sighed. "I didn't forget." When he said that, Chu Xiu's voice became agitated. "Then why is young master still with her?" Qin Anlin closed his eyes. "Aunt Su, must we talk about this?" Crisp Sleeve did not make a sound and only looked at him. Qin Anlin sat up slowly and smiled slightly bitterly. "Aunt Su, the child needs a mother. You can also change their mother, can't you? For example, Mumu likes Xiao Xia very much." Crisp Sleeve's voice was a little agitated. Qin Anlin looked at her with a strange gaze. She had watched him grow up and he had always respected her. But now, she had crossed the line without even realizing it. If it weren't for the old lady, Qin Anlin probably wouldn't have tolerated her interference in his private affairs. "Xia Mian is an employee of King Entertainment. Don't bring her here in the future." Qin Anlin's tone was very indifferent. Chapter 1659. Qin Anlin felt sad for a moment. After a long time, he said calmly, "She and I have 3 children." Soft Sleeve sighed. "But Anlin, you have to have a new life. Even if you're divorced, you can let her see your children." She thought for a moment and said, "There's no need to be ambiguous for a long time. It's not good to drag it out." Chin Anlin walked to the bar and made himself a cup of coffee. He slowly took a sip and said in a low voice, "I know what I'm doing. I'm afraid that you'll forget all that hatred." Soft Sleeve's tone was a bit heavy. "Anlin, when the old lady left, you said that if she returned to the Su family, you would cut off all contact with her. Not only did you not divorce her, but now you're planning to be a loving couple again." Chin Anlin slowly finished his coffee and looked at Soft Sleeve. He smiled bitterly. "That's why you pushed Xia Mian over, isn't it?" Soft Sleeve paused for a moment. "I'm doing it for your own good. If it's for that, you don't have to." Chin Anlin looked down. "Liangqiu and I. It's impossible." With that, his gaze fell on Soft Sleeve's face. His expression was also indifferent. Soft Sleeve couldn't do anything to him. After a long time, she sighed. "Anlin, don't try to fool me." She watched him grow up. How could she not know what he was thinking? He was clearly dragging it out with her. He and Yi Liangqiu had an ambiguous relationship. She saw it this time, but it didn't mean that there wouldn't be a next time. It just meant that she probably wouldn't bring him home again. Thinking of this, she said unhappily, "Of course I know that I've overstepped my boundaries. But Anlin, I'm just worried about you. She's too cruel. The old lady is gone just like that. How can I watch young master sink into it again?" Soft Sleeve closed her eyes. "If you guys really reconcile, the old lady's old subordinates won't let you go. By then, the future of King Entertainment will really be uncertain." Chin Anlin smiled. "Aunt Sue, you don't have to worry about the company. You can just brush me off." Although Soft Sleeve forced a smile, she still didn't agree with Yi Liangqiu. However, her words made Chin Anlin's eyes darken. What Qingqiu said was not without reason. He had some understanding of Liangqiu. Seeing that Chin Anlin was deep in thought, Milky Sleeve didn't stay any longer. She helped to take care of the household matters before leaving. Sitting alone, Chin Anlin thought back to when he saw Yi Liangqiu wearing the watch he bought in the car. She didn't say anything and just put it on. How could he not know that he was in her heart? Otherwise, she wouldn't have let him touch her again and again. Chin Anlin smiled faintly, his smile a little bitter. If he could control it, he wouldn't have to do this. He didn't want to have anything to do with her, but some things couldn't be controlled. On one hand, he hated her, and on the other, he loved her. From that day onwards, he and Yi Liangqiu entered a period of indifference. Yi Liangqiu was also busy and didn't look for him. They were probably guarding their own pride. The top floor office of the ATV. Linda knocked on the door with a document in hand. Yi Liangqiu didn't look up. She asked lightly, "What's the matter?" Chapter 1660. Yi Liangqiu put down the pen in her hand, looked up, and said in a flat tone, "You look angry." Of course, her drama series is popular on ATV, and she promised to come to our New Year's Eve, but now she's back on her word, Linda said angrily. "We shouldn't have supported her in the first place." Yi Liangqiu smiled, "Look at you again. You're getting more and more impatient." Linda was still angry. "I just hate how she pretends to be a white lotus outside, but secretly steals." Linda didn't dare to say the rest of her words. "If it belongs to me, she won't be able to take it away even if she steals it." Yi Liangqiu looked at her. "Also, Xia Mian will definitely be popular, but the important thing is how much ATV will benefit from this. The shareholders will be convinced, and the stock will rise. These are the most important things." However, the most important thing was to gain Su Shiqing's trust. That way, the next step of her plan would be easier to carry out. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. It's reasonable that she chose Mango TV. Anyway, she's still ungrateful. Linda's eyes were spitting fire. Yi Liangqiu was amused. Linda, after all you've said, is that all you've said? Linda didn't say anything, and after a long time, she asked softly, then our New Year's Eve is obviously not big enough. I invited Ran, Yi Liangqiu said calmly. Didn't Xia Mian always want to work with Ran? Linda, you can release this news. Linda was terrified. Ran. Oh my God. He rarely participated in these activities, and the price was sky high. Acting out of friendship, Yi Liangqiu blinked. I think you'll like the thrill of Xia Mian begging you. Linda's eyes lit up. Really? Of course. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Now inform the publicity department, to plan it. Linda nodded. Yeah, I think with Ran, we won't have to worry about the viewership ratings anymore. By the way, contact some of the artists who are still on the fence. Maybe some of them will change their minds. Yi Liangqiu ordered indifferently. Give me the name list and I'll take a look. Linda hesitated for a moment before asking, where's Xia Mian? Yi Liangqiu looked straight at Linda and said slowly, didn't you say she was ungrateful? When she said that, Linda immediately understood and nodded. Okay, Mr. Yi, I understand. Linda acted very quickly. ATV hyped up the news that Ran was going to participate in the New Year celebrations. Just as Yi Liangqiu expected, a lot of artistes signed contracts with Mango TV and ATV at the same time. After all, it was just a recording. Xia Mian, who had been quiet for 2 days, came to ATV in person. She probably couldn't persuade Jia, so she had to come herself. After summer solstice, Xia Mian was broadcast. Xia Mian became a little more popular. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was one of the 4 most popular female stars. Most importantly, she was young. The other female stars were almost 30, but Xia Mian was only 22 or 23. She was young and full of vigor, so when it came to ATV, she demanded an exorbitant price. She agreed to ATV's New Year's recording, but the appearance fee was 10 million. Linda sneered in her heart, 10 million, why don't you just rob a bank? Who do you think you are? You can't even compare to one of Mr. Ye's fingers back then. 10 million, how can your face be bigger than AP's share? Linda said with a smile, our ATV isn't as rich as King Entertainment. The appearance fee is 10 million, so Miss Xia, I'm afraid we can't afford you. Chapter 1661. Haven't you heard of the phrase, priceless? Linda was still smiling. She really wanted to tell Xia Mian that the door was right there and that she should take care. Xia Mian thought for a moment. 8 million, no lower. Linda coughed lightly. Miss Xia, can you sing? Yes. Representative work. Linda smiled. Xia Mian didn't have any representative work. She forced a smile. I can cover other people's songs. You don't have a representative work. It's not worth much. Linda looked regretful. Xia Mian pursed her lips, feeling a little humiliated. Who didn't flatter her these days? Then we have nothing to talk about. Xia Mian was arrogant. Plus, she was a little popular recently, so she put on her sunglasses and proudly left. Her assistant, Little Red, also followed and glared at Linda. Like master, like servant. Linda said to Yi Liangqiu when she reported to Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu smiled. She can't stand this kind of anger now. She paused. But she won't give up. She'll probably find a way to get close to Ran. Although Xia Mian was popular, she wasn't completely popular yet. She was really ambitious. She wanted to open up the international market, so she kept her eyes on the Asian superstar, Ran. She's very smart, but without the resources of King Entertainment, it's impossible for her to do it on her own. Yi Liangqiu looked at Linda. Leak, the hotel where Ran is staying. Linda was stunned. Ran is very upright, but his agent isn't, Yi Liangqiu said indifferently. It took Linda a long time to come back to her senses. Mr. Yi, you mean, I don't mean anything. It just depends on how big her appetite is. Yi Liangqiu's tone was very calm. She lowered her head as she said this. It took Linda a long time to realize that Mr. Yi was going to make a move on Xia Mian. At the very least, he couldn't suppress her openly, so he was going to use underhanded means. Mr. Yi had been in the entertainment industry for a long time, but compared to Mr. Yi, Xia Mian was so naive and stupid. However, Linda was still secretly wondering if Mr. Yi was doing this to compete with King Entertainment or because of a personal grudge. Personally, she was more inclined to settle a personal grudge. She did not dare to say these words to Mr. Yi. She only dared to think about it secretly. Half a month before the Spring Festival, ATV's New Year's recording was about to begin. When Ran arrived in B City, Yi Liangqiu personally drove to the airport to pick him up, accompanied by Linda. Ran was wearing sunglasses and was 185 centimeters tall. Although it was winter and he was dressed all in black, the cold aura he exuded could make anyone kneel down and lick them. The fans at the airport were screaming crazily and shouting Ran's name. In the end, he had to take the VIP passage to escape. Ran's agent knew Chinese, so they didn't have to go through the trouble of translating. After getting into the car, the agent, Che Taixian, took another look at Linda. Yi Liangqiu coughed lightly. He has a girlfriend. The man's eyes widened. He looked at Linda for a long time before saying something meaningful, I can't tell. Linda looked at the middle-aged pervert, smiled, and didn't say anything. She knew what Mr. Yi meant, he didn't want this old thing to have any ideas about her. Ran sat, took off his sunglasses, and said calmly, don't have any ideas about her. Che Taixian also used Korean. I understand. Then he became more obedient. Yi Liangqiu took Ran to the GM hotel and checked into the presidential suite. Chapter 1662. In the elegant environment, Yi Liangqiu and Ran sat face to face, with their assistants on each side. Yi Liangqiu and Ran met when they were filming a music video. They had been very close ever since, but they kept a low profile and no one knew about it. This time, Xia Mian had purposely delayed ATV's New Year's Eve party to make things difficult for them. However, she had never expected that Yi Liangqiu would be able to invite Ran, who was Xia Mian's idol and someone she wanted to be friends with even in her dreams. He was the hottest superstar in Asia. When Xia Mian came over to meet him, she was accompanied by her assistant. Although they were in a restaurant, she was wearing sunglasses and looked very stylish. However, the dress she was wearing was very tight. The black dress accentuated her curves, and the assistant was holding her jacket. When she saw Yi Liangqiu, she paused for a moment and then greeted politely, Hello, Mr. Yi. Yi Liangqiu knew what was going on and smiled. Miss Xia, what a coincidence. Yeah, it's better to meet by chance than to meet by chance. Xia Mian's tone was a bit emotional, but Ran was Korean and didn't understand her at all, nor was he interested in listening. After Xia Mian's greeting, there was a bit of an awkward silence because Yi Liangqiu didn't respond to her anymore. Xia Mian glanced at Ran as if she had just seen him. She was like a little girl seeing her idol. Ran. Oh my God, why are you here? Ran looked up at Xia Mian with a puzzled expression. Did he know this woman? Xia Mian still looked a bit bashful. She put her palms together and asked, Can I have your autograph? Ran's agent, Che Taisien, whispered something into his ear. Ran frowned but still picked up the pen, not knowing where to sign. At this time, Xia Mian stretched out a snow-white arm and said in a sweet voice, "Sign here." Ran glanced at her with a strange look in his eyes. Xia Mian smiled sweetly. Linda leaned close to Yi Liangqiu's ear and whispered, "Look, this woman is too realistic." Her attitude toward President Qin was ambiguous before, but now she looks like a love-struck fool when she sees this Korean. Yi Liangqiu smiled and whispered in his ear, "This Korean is married." Secret marriage. Linda's eyes lit up. Yi Liangqiu was still smiling. Ran's wife's family was very powerful, so he didn't have the guts to cheat on her. Plus, he didn't care about a woman like Xia Mian, who sent herself to his doorstep. However, it was hard to say for his agent. Linda also looked like she was watching a good show. She sat on the side and watched Xia Mian put on a monologue. After a moment of hesitation, Ran took the pen and wrote on Xia Mian's white and tender arm. He wrote with all his might. "Ugh, it hurts." Tears welled up in Xia Mian's eyes. She looked up at Ran, hoping that he would take pity on her. However, Ran didn't understand Chinese. He just put away the pen and didn't say anything else. He treated Xia Mian like an ordinary fan. After that, Ran and Yi Liangqiu conversed in English. They talked about the local customs of China, which was completely personal. Xia Mian didn't know how to respond. It was a bit awkward for her to be here. Fortunately, Ran's agent handed her a business card. "Miss Xia, I've seen your performance. It was very good. If there's a chance in the future, we can work together." Xia Mian was flattered. She took the business card and left in a decent manner. When they saw Yi Liangqiu, they were also surprisingly polite. "Mr. Yi, I won't disturb your meal." Chapter 1663. Xia Mian and her assistant, Little Red, walked to the door of the restaurant. Little Red snorted, "What? Yi Liangqiu is so arrogant. You didn't even stand up." "She's Mr. Yi, and I'm an artist." Xia Mian said lightly, "It's normal to be disrespectful. You weren't like this when you begged us to come to New Year's Eve." The assistant added fuel to the fire. "Now you've invited a Korean back, and he's amazing. I wonder if there's something going on between them." Xia Mian looked at the assistant thoughtfully, and after a while, she whispered into her ear, "Find me a paparazzi, a reliable one." The assistant looked at Xia Mian, and then smiled darkly. After Xia Mian left, Yi Liangqiu took care of Ran for dinner, and then sent him back to his hotel room. "I'll take you on a night tour of B City at 8 p.m. Let's have skewers." Ran clenched his fists, and it was rare for him to let go of his coldness. He gently patted her on the shoulder. "Liangqiu, I'll wait for you." They were good buddies, and in Ran's heart, Liangqiu was of the same gender, so they wouldn't avoid each other. Besides, his wife also liked Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu smiled and left with Linda. As they walked, Yi Liangqiu said in a low voice, "Clear your schedule after 4 p.m. Also, is the food guide ready?" Because it was a private trip, she hoped that Ran's trip would be worthwhile. This time, he didn't charge anything, which was a huge favor. Linda nodded. Ran is very easygoing. Although he looked cold, he took care of people, and treated Mr. Yi very well. She could see that. Yi Liangqiu nodded and didn't say anything else. However, when they turned a corner, she noticed a flash of light. She smiled faintly. It seemed that someone couldn't wait. At night, Yi Liangqiu and Ran went out alone. They both wore sunglasses and masks, and no one knew them. They had a lot of fun. Yi Liangqiu noticed that there was a camera in the dark, but she ignored it. They strolled around B City's night market together. Ran was especially interested in eating skewers. The two of them actually ate more than 700 yuan. I can't take it anymore. Yi Liangqiu reached out to touch her stomach. I'm so full. Ran rested his hands on the bench behind him and said with a smile, it tastes very good. It tastes better than our soaked rice. Of course. If you have the time, I can bring you to try a lot of Chinese delicacies, as long as you dare. Yi Liangqiu had not been able to relax for a long time. There was no pressure when he was with Ran. It was pleasant. As for Anlin, she was very happy to see him, but she had to worry about whether she would say something wrong at any time. She had to struggle between love and hate for him, so she was not as happy as now. Shall we go for a drink? She suggested. Ran readily agreed. However, he still politely called his wife. I'm going to go for a drink with Liangqiu. We might get drunk. What do you think? He deliberately said it in English, so Yi Liangqiu could understand him. She pointed at him and laughed to death. Ran had the coldest appearance, but he was a good man. He did not have any scandals and was very loyal to his wife. She was laughing. Ran looked at her and suddenly passed the phone in his hand to her. She wants to talk to you. Yi Liangqiu stopped laughing and looked at him. However, she still picked up the call. She had met Ran's wife a few times. She was the one who hosted her when she went to Korea. When she picked up the call, Mrs. Rand pleaded politely, Liangqiu, you have to protect him. Chapter 1664. Yi Liangqiu said to Mrs. Rand in a serious tone, I will protect him until he returns home safely. After hanging up the phone, Rand smiled and said, Please, Liangqiu. She stood up and said, Stop it. The night wind blew her long hair up, wrapping it around both of their bodies. Ran was especially gentlemanly as he helped her tame her hair. Together, they took a taxi to the night bar. As expected, they were both drunk. However, Ran was the one protecting Yi Liangqiu. But in the second half of the night, someone somehow recognized Ran in the dark, and the scene became chaotic. People screamed and cried, and the crowd quickly rushed over. Run! Although they drank a little too much, they still knew the consequences. Yi Liangqiu pulled Ran and ran on the streets of B City, with a group of crazy fans chasing after them. Finally, when they returned to his hotel, both of them were exhausted. One fell on the bed, and the other lay on the sofa. They didn't even take a shower, and just spent the night like that. Of course, the next day, Yi Liangqiu's figure as she left the hotel, as well as the photo of her running hand in hand with Ran last night, quickly made all the headlines. Cheating, indulging in private life, indiscreet, all these words were crazily used on Yi Liangqiu. ATV was once again faced with a crisis. Just before the new year, everyone predicted that Yi Liangqiu's public image would collapse. This time, the ratings would be terrible. Including Yi Liangqiu's confidant, Linda. Linda looked at her boss's calm expression and couldn't help but feel anxious. Mr. Yi, aren't you going to clarify? Clarify what? Yi Liangqiu smiled. With Ran. Of course, I can't let someone else slander me like that, Linda said angrily. It must be Xia Mian. Since you know she did it, why are you so anxious? Yi Liangqiu was extremely calm. Besides, this wasn't slander on my head, but, President Qin. Linda exclaimed. After thinking about it carefully, she also understood, yes, if Mr. Yi cheated, wouldn't it mean that President Qin was cuckolded? As long as Qin Anlin doesn't want a divorce, then he will definitely clean up this peace share. Yi Liangqiu looked at Linda. And ATV just happened to hype it up. Linda didn't say anything for a long time. After a long time, she mumbled, "Mr. Yi, isn't this too cruel to President Qin?" Cruel? Yi Liangqiu shook her head. She had already done the cruelest thing to him. This was nothing at all. Moreover, if she didn't do anything, how could she win Su Shiqing's trust? What was the next step of her plan? "Anlin, maybe you hate me and loathe me, but when you hate me, I'm even sadder than you. I'm doing all this against my original intentions. I'm slowly turning into something I don't like. And it's also something you hate." Just as Yi Liangqiu and Linda were talking, King Entertainment was in the center of the storm. Obviously, the reporters were most interested in Qin Anlin's reaction to today's explosive news. Everyone's mentality was the same. When your wife falls in love with someone else and wants to stay in the same hotel room, they all want to see your reaction. Qin Anlin sat in his office with the newspaper spread out in front of him. The photos on the newspaper were very high definition. There were her and Ran sitting together on the street eating skewers, smiling at each other, and Ran holding her long hair. They were both dressed in black, like a couple's outfit. Qin Anlin found that he couldn't control his crazy thoughts. Chapter 1665. The veins on his forehead bulged as he gripped the newspaper in his hand. Kaim stood to the side and cautiously reminded him in a soft voice, "Ran got married in June of this year." "Of course I know that." Qin Anlin put down the newspaper and put his finger on it. "But these photos are here." His gaze was slightly cold. "Any news from ATV?" Kaim looked sympathetically at Chairman Qin and slowly said, "There's no movement." "Is she so sure that I'll help her?" Qin Anlin's tone was a little angry. He slammed his palm on the table with a loud bang. Kaim silently thought to himself, it must be very painful. But the fact that there's a green cloud over President Qin's head must be what makes him so angry. He had to admit that Yi Liangqiu was really ruthless and courageous. Kaim actually took pleasure in her misfortune. This time, President Qin was probably in a real headache. Qin Anlin pondered for a moment. "Help me make an appointment with Ran and Yi Liangqiu." The last three words were said through gritted teeth. Kaim could feel how unwilling he was. He was also stunned for a moment before he understood what Qin Anlin meant. He had to admit that this was a really good move. Instead of wasting his breath explaining, it was better to be magnanimous and let the rumors stop in the hands of the wise. Then, rumors would remain rumors. "Aren't you afraid that Mr. Yi will make some excessive demands?" Kaim hesitated for a moment. Qin Anlin looked up and his gaze fell straight on Kaim's face. He slowly said, "The instigator." Kaim knew that President Qin wasn't muddle-headed from anger. He went out and contacted Ran's agent. The two of them arranged to have a meal together. Of course, some people had to be sacrificed. Originally, King Entertainment wouldn't have done something like this. They wouldn't have given up on their principles. But Kaim knew that this time, Qin Anlin was really angry. What Xia Mian had done could only be resolved by herself. No matter what method she used, only she would bear the consequences. Ran did not immediately agree. His answer was, "I need to ask Liangqiu." When Kaim told Qin Anlin the exact words, the golden pen in Qin Anlin's hand broke into two. He gritted his teeth, "Call Yi Liangqiu." Kaim held back her laughter. President Qin was furious. He called Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu naturally didn't make things difficult for him, because she really needed Qin Anlin to help her clear her name. Kaim reported to Qin Anlin, "Mr. Yi said she's fine." Qin Anlin snorted. "Of course, there's no problem with those who have done wrong." Kaim stifled a laugh. "President Qin, are you saying that Mr. Yi has something to do with Ran?" Qin Anlin glared at him, and Kaim didn't dare to say anything else. After he left, Qin Anlin's body lay heavily on the back of the chair behind him. He felt a sense of helplessness in his heart. She knew him too well, so she always calculated everything. Of course, he could be a little more ruthless. If he did that, all her efforts would be wasted, and ATV would only have one breath left. But it wasn't that simple. He always felt that if he did that, he would really be at the end of the road. Unknowingly, he seemed to have compromised. In this smokeless smoke, he was actually quietly waiting for Su Shiqing to die of old age. When did he, Qin Anlin, become like this? It was all because he couldn't bear to part with her. He got up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and looked at the scenery of B City. Chapter 1666. He stood so tall, but he was lonely. The person who had been by his side was no longer there, but in the opposite direction. Yi Liangqiu, what are you doing? What do you want to do? On the eve of ATV's New Year's Eve, Qin Anlin met up with RNA with a green glow. Of course, in addition to Kaim, he also brought Xia Mian. On Ran's side, it was Che Taisien. For this meeting, Qin Anlin instructed his media outlets to write the headline, King Entertainment's president Qin Anlin and his wife entertain the King of Asia, Ran. They got along so well, it couldn't be that they had been cuckolded, right? Qin Anlin's interaction with Ran was a bit stiff, but Yi Liangqiu was very calm. Xia Mian gritted her teeth. It was obvious that President Qin was wiping her but for Yi Liangqiu. However, she had a smile on her face and toasted Che Taisien from time to time. She was still counting on this man to pull some strings for her to cooperate with Ran. While she was drunk, Yi Liangqiu went to the bathroom. Standing in front of the basin, she slowly washed her hands. Suddenly, someone appeared behind her. Miss Xia, did you drink too much? Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Xia Mian leaned to the side and looked at Yi Liangqiu coldly. Don't think that I don't know what you're playing. Yi Liangqiu continued washing her hands and smiled. I don't quite understand what you mean, Miss Xia. She smiled lightly. Does this have something to do with you, Miss Xia? Xia Mian stared at Yi Liangqiu. Why did you ask me to film ATV's New Year's Eve for free? Xia Mian wanted to be famous, but she also needed money. She didn't want to participate in an event like this without a reward, not to mention that she was arranged to dance for Ran. Yi Liangqiu looked at Xia Mian. You're not satisfied. Although she was smiling, there was no smile in her eyes at all. Xia Mian was stunned. After a while, she pursed her lips and squeezed out a few words. I don't want to go. Yi Liangqiu chuckled, wiped her hands, and looked at Xia Mian. Sure. I think we'll be very busy that night, and there might be a few waitresses missing. Miss Xia, you look great in a cheongsam. Xia Mian was so angry that her lips were trembling. Yi Liangqiu, you've gone too far. Yi Liangqiu's eyes darkened. Miss Xia, you don't need me to remind you of what you have done, do you? Xia Mian was stunned. After a while, she shrieked, did you do it on purpose? I didn't ask the paparazzi to follow us. Yi Liangqiu sneered. Xia Mian, you're on your own now. Putting up with it once didn't mean he would put up with it every time. Xia Mian stared at her back, unwilling to give up. She lost her mind and shouted at her back, do you dare say that there's nothing going on between you and that Korean? Did nothing happen between the two of you in the same room? Yi Liangqiu slowly turned around and looked at Xia Mian. What does that have to do with you? Xia Mian was stunned for a moment. In the end, she had nothing to say. After Yi Liangqiu left, Xia Mian's body slid down to the ground. Tears slowly flowed down her face. She had tried everything she could, but she couldn't touch Yi Liangqiu at all. Instead, she had put herself in an awkward position. She couldn't give up. She really couldn't. But what could she do no matter how unwilling she was? In the end, Xia Mian participated in ATV's New Year's Eve show for free, while Yi Liangqiu joined King Entertainment's tail. Yi Liangqiu had taken advantage of the situation. Chapter 1667. She was a popular actress. How could she do such a lowly job? However, she had to do it because President Qin had guessed or was certain that she was behind Ran and Yi Liangqiu's headlines. When she left the hotel, Little Red helped her out. Tonight, Xia Mian needed to get drunk. As long as she was drunk, she would have the courage. Wasn't the entertainment industry full of unspoken rules? She just needed to get used to it. Qin Anlin didn't like her. Was it because she wasn't high enough? If one day, she could stand in the limelight like Yi Liangqiu, would President Qin take a second look at her? Yes, that must be it. When she was drunk, she dug out Ran's agent's phone number from her purse. Her eyes were a bit disillusioned. She stared at it for a long time, crying and laughing at the same time. Finally, she dialed the number. What awaited her was the erosion of the night. It was destruction. But she knew that if she didn't give, how could she get? She wanted to be the diva of Asia. That night, she slept next to a strange man. She slept next to that middle-aged man, and her body was wantonly treated by that man. She resisted the urge to vomit and pretended to be happy. She could only swallow those tears. The night was long. For Yi Liangqiu, tonight was also torture. Qin Anlin had personally taken off her green hat, but it didn't mean that he would let her go. After everyone left, he was still sitting on the sofa in the private room. He had a headache, probably because he had drunk a little too much. He rubbed his forehead with his fingers. For a long time, he didn't speak. Kaim and Linda were responsible for seeing the guests off. Only the two of them were left in the spacious private room. Yi Liangqiu looked at him quietly and slowly walked over. She took over his hand and massaged his forehead with her fingers. She was startled when her hand was suddenly caught. He grabbed her hand, raised it high, and looked at her with a burning gaze. "It's not my head that hurts, it's here." He pointed at his heart with one hand. Yi Liangqiu fell on the carpet and called him softly, "Anlin." His fingers were still tightly gripping hers. He stared into her eyes and asked word by word, "Why did you do this?" Since she didn't say anything, he continued, "Yi Liangqiu, don't pretend to be innocent in front of me. You knew that Xia Mian had hired paparazzi to follow her, so why did you let them take those photos?" She half knelt on the ground and looked up at him in a humble manner. Suddenly, she smiled. "Yes. I know." She struggled but failed. Enduring the pain, she fearlessly looked into his eyes. "Qin Anlin, do you feel uncomfortable looking at the photos? But Xia Mian is always around you. Don't I feel bad?" She paused and closed her eyes. "Actually, she can enter and leave your apartment freely." "Qin Anlin. How did you restrain yourself at that time?" She questioned him in a cold voice. Qin Anlin stared at her for a long time before he said softly, "So, this is your counterattack?" "Yes." Her expression was a little stubborn and willful. "I don't like her being around you." After saying that, she stared at him and never looked away. "Yi Liangqiu, do you know what you're saying?" His voice was extremely hoarse. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. How could she not know? Her body was suddenly pulled into his arms. Then, his slightly tipsy lips sealed her mouth. Chapter 1668. He kissed her wantonly, filled with anger and indignation. Yi Liangqiu raised her head. Her lips were occupied by him, and she felt as though her neck was about to break. They were already very close to each other, but he still held her waist and pressed her against his body. She struggled in a sorry state, but the more she struggled, the more pathetic she looked. The fragrance of the wine mixed with the scent of a man and a woman's eyes was intoxicating. She didn't know when, but she had fallen limply into his arms. Her fingers held onto his shoulders, and her long nails left a long scratch on his expensive clothing. It went all the way to his waist before he managed to catch it. She cried out softly, "Anlin." He was drunk and even angrier, but he had no intention of venting his anger in a private room. Leaving her lips, he stared deeply into her eyes. He pursed his lips and said coldly, "Get up." She was dazed for a moment before realizing that she was sitting on his lap in a shameful position. "Can't bear to get up." He narrowed his eyes, and his slender fingers hooked onto her chin, forcing her to look at him. At this moment, the two of them weren't in a good state. Both of their eyes were misty, and there was a lingering passion in them. Under his gaze, her body trembled slightly. She shrunk back, wanting to get down, but was held back by him again. "Yi Liangqiu." He pressed her tightly into his arms. She buried her face in the side of his neck, feeling his body temperature. He was very hot, the kind of heat that was about to burn. "If there's a way, I also want to forget you. Or even divorce." He spoke quietly, as though he wasn't drunk. However, she knew that he was drunk, or else he wouldn't have said those words. His arms were holding her in place with a brutal force, and his voice was hoarse. "But you use my feelings time and time again." His tone was bleak, and there was a rare sense of despair. Yi Liangqiu laid on his shoulder. She wanted to struggle, but she didn't dare. She believed that if she dared to move at this moment, he would consign her to eternal damnation. "Yi Liangqiu, how can you be so cruel?" His face shifted slightly. Every inch of his movement felt like it was ironing her skin. Her pores felt like they were being ironed by scorching lava, and they were scorching hot. She had nowhere to retreat and could only stare into his eyes. Her swollen red lips trembled slightly. "N." His face pressed against hers. It was very tight and hotter than ever before. She could barely move, and he was hot everywhere. Although his voice was soft, she could feel his anger. She had nothing to say, she had done exactly as he had said. "Yi Liangqiu. You're amazing." He closed his eyes and slowly said, "Don't force me to attack you." After saying that, he turned her face and his voice became cold and hard. "Are you in such a hurry to see me?" They hadn't been intimate since Christmas, but they did see each other. Firstly, he was soft-hearted and wanted her to see the child. Secondly, he wanted to see Mo. He always wanted to minimize the damage, but he didn't expect that she was really cruel. She could even destroy her own reputation, so what else couldn't she do? Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes. "Anlin, I don't know what you're talking about." Chapter 1669. She suddenly looked up and looked at him anxiously. "Anlin." He abruptly let go of her and smiled faintly. "Liangqiu, are you still there?" His hand was on her chest, as if he was holding on to her heart. She looked at him and felt embarrassed as though she had been seen through. She thought about it before answering him slowly, "Yes. I've always been there." But he didn't let her go and asked urgently, "Are you still as innocent as before?" She didn't say anything. Qin Anlin's slender and beautiful hand supported his forehead. The dim yellow light shone on his face, leaving a side profile for her. She looked, her fingers gently landing on his palm, tightly interlocking with his fingers. Her face was also pressed against his palm, murmuring, "Anlan, my love is still here, this is the most important thing." He turned his head and looked at her. After a long time, he said lightly, but I don't dare to love you anymore. At some point, probably when he fell in love with her, he lost his courage. He gently pushed her hand away and stood up slowly. That's it. After dealing with the matter, he was unprecedentedly disheartened. What he valued and protected were not the most important things to her. The most important thing to her was to keep her ATV. Yi Liangqiu was pushed away by him and her body fell on the sofa. And Qin Anlan's heart was filled with desolation as he walked towards the door step by step. She looked at him in a daze and suddenly got up. The next second, she hugged him from behind. Qin Anlan's body froze and his voice was slightly cold. What do you mean by this? Don't go. She said a little rascally and then buried her face behind him, acting coquettishly. Qin Anlan's originally cold and hard heart suddenly softened a little. He turned his head and said in a low voice, Yi Liangqiu, do you know what this means? I know. Her tone was even softer as she leaned her whole body against him. It was also a kind of seduction. He was well aware that he couldn't resist such temptation. He suddenly turned his head and looked at her with burning eyes. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and gently went forward, hugging his waist and burying her face in his chest. Anlan, let's call a truce, okay? When she said that, her breath was on the side of his neck. His body stiffened and then he lowered his head. He was very close to her. His nose was touching hers, and his deep eyes were also very close to hers. His voice was hoarse. You want to sleep with me, right? She wrapped her arms around his neck. Yes. Qin Anlan narrowed his eyes tightly. He suddenly picked her up and walked straight outside. The receptionist of the GM hotel looked as if she was facing a formidable enemy. She stammered, the compendium, the post-mortem medicine, and the wound medicine have all been prepared. We will also deliver breakfast to you tomorrow morning. Qin Anlan carried Yi Liangqiu horizontally, but his gaze was slightly cold. He didn't look anxious at all. Help me get a room next to Ran, he said calmly. The receptionist hesitated. But little boss Pei has already prepared a long-term suite for President Qin. I said next to Ran. Qin Anlan threw the black gold card down. Also, prepare double the things I mentioned just now. Double? Would Jin die tomorrow? Would he have to collect his corpse? The receptionist hesitated. Qin Anlan repeated. Do you need me to call your little boss Pei? Chapter 1670. Therefore, the receptionist quickly checked them in and invited them to the suite next to Ran's. Is the soundproofing good? Qin Anlan placed Yi Liangqiu on the sofa and asked with raised eyebrows. The receptionist put down 2 big boxes of textbooks and trauma medicine. She was silently praying for Yi Liangqiu. After hearing Qin Anlan's words, she smiled and said, President Qin, don't worry. GM Hotel has the best soundproofing. As long as you close the windows, you won't be able to hear anything outside. However, she quickly understood what President Qin meant. She smiled warmly and said, President Qin, you can enjoy yourself to your heart's content. The people next door won't hear you. What if the windows are open? Qin Anlan lit a cigarette and asked calmly. The receptionist was stunned. She looked a little uncomfortable and said, then, keep your voice down. How shameful. How loud and how much strength did he have to use to worry about such a problem? Qin Anlan looked deeply at Yi Liangqiu and then waved the receptionist away. He didn't start eating immediately. Instead, he stood by the window, opened it, and smoked 2 cigarettes. Yi Liangqiu was still sitting on the sofa, as if she was waiting for his verdict. In fact, she knew what he was thinking, but she was willing to indulge him. Qin Anlan put out the cigarette and turned his body slightly. He waved and said, come here. She slowly got up, walked over to him and hugged him from behind. Anlin. He lit another cigarette and said coldly, "Kiss me." She tightened her grip and put her lips on the back of his neck. Their lips touched. She was really dilly-dallying. It was the same 2 kisses back and forth. She didn't hit him at all. He thought he was calm, but after a long time, he couldn't help it. After smoking a cigarette, his whole body was on fire. He turned sideways and hugged her to the front, kissing her fiercely. "Yi Liangqiu, there's no one more despicable than you." She was carried to the balcony in his arms. He was torturing her so that she would make a sound of shame. Next door, Ran was video chatting with his wife on the balcony. He couldn't help but hear the commotion. After a long time, he finally recognized Yi Liangqiu's voice. At first, he was stunned, then he smiled. In the end, he didn't close the window. If that man did it on purpose, then he would fulfill his wish. It was really childish and adorable. That night, Yi Liangqiu finally understood what it meant to be better off dead than alive. He only let her go when it was almost dawn. In the end, the 2 of them caught a cold together. She had a simple cold, but Qin Anlin had an overdose. Although he was still alive, his corpse was not far from being collected. By the time the front desk brought breakfast over, the bedroom was in a state of chaos. It looked like a battlefield. She swallowed her saliva and called the doctor. Yi Liangqiu was fine. She only took medicine, but Qin Anlin had to be put on an 4-drip. It would be embarrassing to go to the hospital, so she hung up on the spot. Linda came over at noon. She looked at President Qin, who was lying on the bed, and felt sorry for him. "It must have been tough last night," Yi Liangqiu whispered something in her ear. Linda hesitated, but she still went. After they left, Yi Liangqiu covered Qin Anlin with the blanket. She was the one who suffered last night, but he was the one who was sick. No matter how cruel she was, she couldn't abandon him at such a time. However, when her hand touched the blanket, he caught it. Chapter 1671. Yi Liangqiu lowered her head and looked at him. Qin Anlin's gaze was gloomy. His body was weak, but he was still unwilling to let go of her and held her stubbornly. At this moment, he was like a rascal child. Yi Liangqiu followed his strength and laid down on his lower abdomen. Through the blanket, she hugged his waist. "Anlin, can you sleep?" She looked up and said in a gentle voice. He lay there, his face a little red. That was the after effect of. He slowly reached out his large palm and held her hair. It was so soft and obedient. She lay there obediently and hugged him tightly with her slender arms. She buried her face in his chest and slept with him. Qin Anlin was angry at first, but he was really tired. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. When he woke up, it was already in the afternoon. When he opened his eyes, his hands immediately moved downward until he touched her hair. Only then did he feel relieved. A groan sounded from his throat. The person on top of him woke up. He looked up. "Anlin." Qin Anlin pursed his lips and closed his eyes again. "Go get me a glass of water." His fever had subsided, but his body was still weak. Besides him, there was only her in this suite. Yi Liangqiu propped herself up and reached out to touch his forehead. Only then did she feel relieved. She got off the bed and walked toward the living room. Qin Anlin turned sideways to look at her back view. Even though she had given birth to 3 children, her figure was still as beautiful as before. The bathrobe was loosely tied around her waist. Her long hair was slightly damp, and it was as alluring as seaweed. Just by looking at her, he could understand why he had been so indulgent last night. To him, she was the best medicine in the village, in the blink of an eye, she disappeared from the bedroom door and came back after a while with a glass of water and 2 pills in her hands. Qin Anlin propped himself up and looked at her. "I'm fine now." This meant that he didn't want to take the medicine. Only then did Yi Liangqiu remember that she had been with him for so long, but she had never seen him get sick. This was the first time she had seen him like this, afraid of taking medicine. However, her heart was filled with tenderness. In their love-hate relationship, when he despised her like this, she felt something akin to taking care of a child. It turned out that he could also be fragile, and he also needed to be coaxed. Yi Liangqiu put the glass of water on the bedside table, spread out the medicine in her hand, and looked at him. "Afraid of taking medicine?" Qin Anlin looked a little uneasy. He coughed lightly and said, "Of course not." "Then eat for me to see." She moved her hand forward and brought it to his lips. Her expression was that of a little sister. Qin Anlin looked up at her, his gaze unfathomable. He lowered his head to look at the medicine in her palm. He couldn't see the medicine clearly. He could only see her white palm and beautiful fingers. He remembered that these hands were so lifelike. As he thought of this, his body ached a little. He narrowed his eyes and looked at her. "Feed me." His voice was already hoarse. Actually, he was just saying it. He didn't mean it that way. However, Yi Liangqiu put the medicine near his lips. First, it touched her palm. Then, it was the extremely bitter medicine that he hated so much. Qin Anlin instinctively wanted to avoid it, but her palm quickly stuffed the medicine into his mouth. Her action was especially rough. Qin Anlin glared at her, but she didn't let go. Chapter 1672. Yi Liangqiu laughed and took the water to feed him. However, he pursed his lips tightly and did not feed her the medicine. Yi Liangqiu chuckled. "It's so bitter." She brought the glass closer to him. "Be good and take the medicine." He still ignored her. She immediately understood. She took a sip and crawled to his side. She knelt on her knees and pressed her lips against his. She really could not do that, so she froze there. His dark eyes stared at her for a long time before he reached out and pressed the back of her head to his side. At the same time, he parted her lips, and took the water in her mouth. As for her, she also tasted the bitter taste of medicine, and her eyes widened. However, he pushed the medicine in his mouth into hers. Yi Liangqiu was a little confused. She had no choice but to push the medicine back. Both of them shared the medicine. When their lips parted, her eyes were already blurred. He asked coldly, "Have you learned it?" "What?" She looked at him, puzzled. She was still kneeling on the ground. That fragile state of hers made him want to bully her. However, he was powerless even though he wanted to. This was the first time that he felt a sense of heroism in his heart, but he was powerless to do anything about it. He hated her in his heart, so he turned his face away and ignored her. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. She felt annoyed and amused at the same time. Why was he behaving like a child? She did not say a word and just looked at him. Qin Anlin pursed his lips and said impatiently, "Kiss." "Ah." She thought for a long time before she understood. Kissing. Didn't she know how to do it in the past? Qin Anlin stared at her and said indifferently, "You know it now." He wanted her to please him. Men who were sick were so difficult to deal with. However, Yi Liangqiu was willing to satisfy him at this moment. Hence, she moved her lips and kissed him gently. He did not move at all. At most, he moved his lips to make it easier for her to kiss him deeply. For the first time, she took the initiative and completed the French kiss. It was a strange feeling as she pressed his shoulder and did that to him, as if she were forcing him. At this moment, he was sick. His eyelids were drooping and his long eyelashes were drooping. Unexpectedly, there was a feeling of weakness. She withdrew and looked at him with watery eyes. She asked softly, "Is this enough?" "Not enough." His tone was still indifferent, but she felt a little awkward and stuffy. Yi Liangqiu smiled and kissed his forehead, coaxing him, "It's contagious." As soon as she said that, he pressed her down and kissed her roughly. The kiss was so thorough that it ignited the fire in his body. Yi Liangqiu clasped his shoulder. She wanted to stop him, but she couldn't. But just as they were about to explode, he let go of her with a slightly uncomfortable expression. She was sitting in his arms and her eyes were in a daze. It was only when she came back to her senses that she noticed his condition. Yi Liangqiu leaned on his shoulder and couldn't help but giggle. "Anlin, it's okay. Actually, I don't really want to." She laughed softly and whispered into his ear. It sounded like she was comforting him, but it was actually teasing him. Qin Anlin grabbed her long hair and kissed her indiscriminately. He really had no energy left. He lay heavily on the bed and looked at the ceiling. "Yi Liangqiu, if you dare to laugh again, I promise I'll kill you later." Chapter 1673. He turned his head and glared at her. Although he was fierce, she saw warmth in his eyes. She smiled and kissed his tall nose. "Are you hungry?" He glanced at her. "I'm going to cook." She got out of bed and went to wash herself. She even threw him a phone to relieve his boredom. After she left, Qin Anlin lay down and looked in the direction of the door. He knew that he had indulged her a little too much. He knew her intentions, but he had indulged her again and again. He was greedy for every minute and second with her. Even if he would hate her when he turned around, when she smiled at him, when she kissed him and coaxed him, he would feel that she loved him. She still had him in her heart. Qin Anlin lifted the quilt and put on his pajamas. He was a little dizzy, but he felt much better. She walked to the kitchen. She tied her hair into a ponytail and cooked in front of the kitchen counter. The soft sunlight poured in from the window and shone on the side of her face. It was so clear that he could see every pore on her face. Her skin was fair, and after being covered with a layer of soft light, she looked gentler, just like a little wife who cooked for her husband. Qin Anlin leaned against the door and looked at it for a while before asking softly, "How much longer?" She nodded and smiled. "Half an hour will be enough." His eyes were burning. "I mean, how much longer do you have to leave?" The vegetables in her hand fell to the ground. She was shocked and slowly bent down to pick them up. She rinsed them under the tap and began to cut them again. Halfway through, she stopped and said softly, "I'll leave after cooking." His eyes were full of exploration. He looked at her and smiled mockingly. "Aren't you going to stay and continue to charm me? Or should I say, seduce me, Mr. Yi?" Yi Liangqiu cut the vegetables much faster. Her voice was fast as if she didn't want to hear what he said. But it was too fast, and her fingers accidentally cut. She was a little lost in thought. She looked at the bloodstain without saying anything and continued to cut. She cooked the dishes mechanically. He kept saying something, but she chose not to listen. Finally, 4 dishes and a soup were ready. The dishes were still so well cooked, and the 2 of them were still the same. But it was different. She untied her apron, looked up and smiled bitterly. "I'm leaving first." He sat in front of the dining table without making a sound. She understood the conflict in his heart. Love and hate were often separated by a thin line. She understood that it was not his fault, but she still had to do what she had to do, even if he hated her more. She walked past him and was about to head to the bedroom to change her clothes when he grabbed her hand. "Eat with me before you leave." But when he squeezed, she cried out softly, "It hurts." He loosened his grip a little and clasped her fingers. Looking at the wound on her finger, his face turned livid. "Why didn't you tell me that you were injured?" "It's just a small injury." "It's nothing," she said lightly. Under his intense gaze, she turned her face away uncomfortably. But he was obviously angry. "Is that so? If you don't need to say it, then what do you need to say?" Raising her hand, he said, "Yi Liangqiu, tell me." He tightened his grip slightly, and she let out a soft cry. But she couldn't stop him. It was only when her fingers started bleeding again that he realized how rough he was. He changed his grip to a gentle one, and his expression was also uncomfortable. "Let me help you bandage it." Semi-compulsively, he took her to the bedroom, got the medical kit, and let her sit on his lap. Chapter 1674. He turned his head sideways and said softly, "I'll definitely kill you." She chuckled softly and said, "I'll be waiting." Qin Anlan's gaze deepened and he looked at her deeply. After a long while, he pulled her over and touched the place where he had touched her. "Are you sure?" Her breathing was a little erratic and her eyes were sparkling. Qin Anlan glared at her and retracted his hand. He lay down and calmed down for a while. "Let's go eat." "My hand is hurt," she said softly and looked up at him. His gaze was even more unfriendly as he said angrily, "I'll feed you." He sat up and she sat on top of him with her arm hanging around his neck. Her intention was obvious. Qin Anlan glared at her. "Yi Liangqiu, it's just a finger injury." But she had let an overly indulgent man serve her. But she refused to come down. She buried her face in his neck and nibbled on him like a kitten. His life was about to be taken away by her. "It hurts too." Finally, she pressed herself against his hot neck and looked up at him, her voice low and husky. At this moment, her long hair was scattered hopelessly on the white bathrobe. Coupled with her innocent and fragile expression, she looked like she was in her early 20s again, which made him want to kill her. However, he would probably die before he killed her. Qin Anlan gripped her waist, his dark eyes flashing with the light of wanting to devour her. His voice was unbelievably husky. "Behave." She must have seen his sorry state as she lay there and laughed. It was as though they had returned to the past. Both of them were startled and their expressions were a little thought-provoking. After a long while, he got up and carried her to the dining room. So what if he doted on her once? She was also silent. Perhaps she had realized that this kind of doting might not happen again in the future, so the atmosphere was a little subtle and uncomfortable. Yi Liangqiu sat down and he took some food for her. Seeing that she was not eating, he asked lightly, "Do you really want me to feed you?" She lowered her head. "No need." Her voice was a little gloomy. However, he calmly ate his meal. "Unhappy? Do you still care?" She was the same as him, indifferent. This time, he didn't answer. They all knew the reason why he didn't answer, and there was no need to say it. His illness was not completely cured, but there was no reason for him to continue to stay. As time went on, it became cruel. When he left, he was dressed neatly, hiding his sickly appearance. He looked at her seriously. "Let's make an appointment to have a meal together during the new year." She nodded and they walked out together. Just as he expected, the newspaper reported that he and Yi Liangqiu had spent the night together. This time, there was even a vague report from the receptionist, such as 2 big boxes of books, trauma medicine. After reading the newspaper, Qin Anlan tossed it aside and looked up at Kaim. "Where's the PR department? Why aren't you doing anything?" Kaim hesitated. They think that President Chin doesn't care. Chin Anlin pursed his thin lips as if he was about to lose his temper, but in the end, he just leaned against the back of the chair and said nothing. Kim knew that this was President Chin's compromise. In fact, when facing Mr. Yi, President Chin had really compromised time and time again. Mr. Yi was too ruthless. While Chin Anlin was fuming, Yi Liangqiu was in the recording center of ATV. Chapter 1675. Yi Liangqiu and Linda watched from the side stage. Linda's tone was full of surprise. Mr. Yi, why do you think Li Qi has changed so much? I heard that she secretly contacted Mango TV a few times, but she's been behaving herself lately. Yi Liangqiu looked at Li Qi, the host, and smiled. Do you think she's stupid? She's always been a mainstay at ATV. Now that she's at Mango TV, where do you think she'll rank with her qualifications? Linda immediately buttered her up. That's because she sees hope and feels that ATV has a chance to shine again. Yi Liangqiu nodded. Keep an eye out for any good ones, Linda understood. Yeah, we need to train more people. Otherwise, it'll be difficult when the contract expires. It's good that you understand. Yi Liangqiu slowly sat down. In this Vanity Fair, there were no true feelings between companies and artists, only benefits. She wanted artists to rely on the company, and not let the company be led by the nose by artists. That would be sad. Linda nodded, and then said softly, "It's Ran." At the same time, the audience was in an uproar. The female fans were all excited, shouting Ran's name, holding up signs, and crying in excitement. As for Xia Mian, who was dancing for Ran, in all fairness, her style was very beautiful, but Ran's aura was too strong. Beside Ran, Xia Mian didn't feel like she existed at all. She was so weak that no one even noticed that Ran's dance partner was the popular female star, Xia Mian. This made Xia Mian feel lucky and angry at the same time. Backstage, she kept throwing a tantrum. The little assistant comforted her for a long time, but to no avail. Later, it was a phone call from Che Taisien that made Xia Mian feel better. When she left, the little assistant stopped her and said hesitantly, "Isn't it too risky? If someone finds out, it'll damage our image." Xia Mian sneered. This kind of thing happens too often in this industry. As long as you don't say anything, who will know? She knew very well that King Entertainment seemed to be supporting her, but they had positioned her as a domestic female star. If she wanted to go abroad, she had to work with a king like Ran. Che Taisien was the only person who could help her, so how could she bear to let him go? Without hesitation, Xia Mian left with her bag and threw herself into the arms of Che Taehyun, a Korean. She did everything she could to please the middle-aged man. Che Taehyun promised to give her a supporting role in a blockbuster. The male lead was not Ran, but he was still a heavenly king. Xia Mian was very satisfied. She had served him wholeheartedly that night. Then, she realized that the only way out was to take advantage of him. Xia Mian left with red marks all over her body. 5 minutes later, Yi Liangqiu was standing at the door. She pushed the door open and entered. In the decadent bedroom, there was a choking smell of love jade that lingered for a long time. Slowly walking in, Che Taisien's expression was a little flustered. He hurriedly tied his bathrobe and laughed dryly. "Mr. Yi." A pure Beijing accent wasn't something that Koreans could learn. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and looked at him. "Are you satisfied?" She sat down on the sofa. Che Taehyun immediately followed her and poured her a cup of tea. "Satisfied. It's been a long time since I've had such a fresh taste in Korea." Chapter 1676. Che Taisien understood and smiled. I can't accept Miss Ye's money. If Miss Ye hadn't recommended me to Ran back then, I wouldn't be where I am today. With that, he pushed the check back. Since he didn't want it, Yi Liangqiu didn't refuse and took it back. Che Taisien thought for a moment and continued, after all these years, no one can remember the song Ren from back then. Miss Yi has been my benefactor for the rest of my life. Yi Liangqiu was very polite. You did a good job. That's why you have a place in Korea. Che Taisien, or Song Ren, had a scandal in the entertainment industry and couldn't go on. However, he was a very good agent and a friend of Ying Jia. Xia Mian had no way of knowing this. It just so happened that Ren needed an agent at that time. Song Ren knew Korean and had connections in Korea, so Yi Liangqiu recommended him. In the blink of an eye, almost 10 years had passed. That time was after Yi Liangqiu's famous film, Late Autumn. Che Taisien and Yi Liangqiu both recalled the past and couldn't help but sigh. Mr. Yi, what a coincidence. This time, the film is the Korean version of Late Autumn, and Xia Mian wants to compete with Miss Yi. No wonder she doesn't mind being the second female lead. Yi Liangqiu smiled carelessly, then raised her head slightly. That time, I was also the second female lead. Che Taisien still remembered the scene back then. Yi Liangqiu had filmed an intense scene, but she couldn't do it well. Later, Qin Anlin had to take her away, and after that, things were different. Time had passed, and people in B City had long forgotten what he looked like. He grew a mustache and became Che Taisien, while Yi Liangqiu became Mr. Yi and Qin Anlin. Che Taisien sighed. As long as Mr. Yi needs my help, I will do it. Then he said in a low voice, Don't worry, Mr. Yi. I won't do stupid things for women anymore. What's a woman? Wealth in my hands is real. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and said nothing more. That night, Che Taisien sat for half the night. He thought of the woman in the past. The woman who betrayed her husband and betrayed him. He thought that the woman would give up everything for him and go with him. However, after the matter was exposed, she insisted that he was the one who seduced her and even wanted to sue him. After fleeing to South Korea in a sorry state, women were nothing more than playthings to him. Especially women like Xia Mian. When Yi Liangqiu went out, she was holding a disc in her hand, which was given to her by Che Taisien. The exciting video of him and Xia Mian. 12 GS. Her eyes were a little deep, just like the night. Her body was exhausted, but her eyes were cold. When she walked out of the hotel, the lanterns had already fallen. In the empty street, she actually felt like she was homeless. At the end of the road, there was a slender figure dressed in black, blending into the night. He stood there leisurely, his posture relaxed, and the faint light from the sky shone on his side, elongating a long shadow. Yi Liangqiu gave up the idea of driving and walked toward the person 50 meters away. The fierce night wind blew, cutting her soft face. The pain was just like that day, the familiar pain, the familiar temperature. By the time she came back to her senses, she had already fallen into his embrace. Her face was buried in his shoulder, rubbing against the material of his coat. Even though they had a few nights of absurdity, it was not as touching as this moment. Chapter 1677. Why are you here? She rested her face on his shoulder and did not dare to move. She was afraid that if she moved or looked at him, it would all be an illusion and he would disappear. His shoulder was cold, but it warmed up after a while. She buried her face in his arms and hugged his neck, refusing to let go. He patted her back and asked with a hoarse voice, How did you know I was looking for you? Yi Liangqiu let go of him and took a step back, looking at him in the dark of the night. Under the streetlights, Her skin was almost translucent and her facial features looked fresh. Isn't that so? She smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming as though they contained all the stars in the universe. She turned around as though she wanted to leave. He caught her hand and hugged her from behind. Even though they were wearing thick clothes, it felt exceptionally warm. He lowered his head and buried her face in his neck. His voice was slightly hoarse. Are you cold? With that said, he looked at her car that was parked by the roadside and asked deliberately, why aren't you driving? Yi Liangqiu looked at her car and suddenly realized that she did not see his car. She looked up and asked, how did you get here? Qin Anlin suddenly grabbed her hand. Let's take the subway. Subway. Him. She looked at him suspiciously while his gaze deepened. As they walked forward, he held her hand and said slowly, some people even make use of a man to sleep with them. Why can't I take the subway? Yi Liangqiu looked at him sideways and said slowly, but I don't want to take the subway. I want to. He paused and looked at her with a clear gaze. Mr. Yi, let's go for skewers. Skewers. She was shocked once again. In her impression, Qin Anlin was a nocturnal animal, but that was only limited to high-end clubs. For example, drinking in bars, KTV in private rooms, and eating skewers, he had nothing to do with it. What? You can bring the Koreans, but you can't bring me. His tone was displeased, and his eyes were burning. Yi Liangqiu exclaimed, Anlin, are you jealous? She was dressed in a serious manner, and her expression was too innocent, which made her look very cute. Qin Anlin glared at her and pulled her into the subway station. Standing at the ticket vending booth, Qin Anlin crossed his arms and looked at her. You buy it. You're the one who wanted to take the subway. She snorted and ignored him. I don't have change. Qin Anlin sneered, do you also throw a tantrum like this when you're with Ran? I saw how well you served him. Qin Anlin, it's embarrassing to be so jealous. She also sneered. Are you jealous? Why didn't I know about this? He looked at the girls passing by and whispered a few words to them. The good-looking young girl immediately took out 10 yuan from her wallet and gave it to him. She waved her hand and left with her friends, laughing and joking. Qin Anlin studied for a while more before buying 2 tickets. He tilted his head and looked at her smugly. Yi Liangqiu snorted, seduction. Thank you, Mr. Yi, for complimenting my appearance. He smiled, his eyes bright and dazzling. His black coat made him look even more handsome. Even in the crowded subway, he was still dazzling. Yi Liangqiu pouted. Shameless. Chapter 1678. When they got there, she stretched out her fair hand. Give it to me. He placed a piece of paper on her palm and smiled. I got this by selling my husband. After saying that, both of them were stunned. Husband. This word seemed to have not been used since they broke up. Saying it now was natural, but it sounded unfamiliar. Yi Liangqiu was the first to come back to her senses. She smiled and took it to go through the security check. He followed behind her, his tall figure looming over her. With the 2 of them in front and 1 at the back, the atmosphere was a little strange. It was like 2 teenagers in their 20s throwing a tantrum, neither of them paying attention to the other. Until the 5th line arrived, and he walked in front of her. She was stunned for a moment, and then her hand was held by him. She looked up, only to see his back. It was 10:00 at night, and the subway was crowded. After squeezing her way up, she was almost lying on his back. The temperature on the subway was also high, and soon, her back was sweating. Qin Anlin was probably also feeling hot. He took off his jacket and put it on his arm. He slowly held her back with one hand, trying to pull her forward. Yi Liangqiu dodged, and in the end, he pulled a young girl. But her looks were a little breathtaking. The young girl looked at Qin Anlan's handsome face, and her face flushed red. She was so excited that she was about to faint. Oh my God, he looked exactly like the Prince Charming of her dreams. She was about to faint. Someone pinch her and tell her that this was real and not a dream. In contrast to the girl's beautiful dream, Qin Anlan's face was livid. His expression was fierce, and he glared at the ugly girl in front of him before turning his head. The culprit actually dared to laugh secretly. Yi Liangqiu. He called her name unhappily, but he forgot that they were on the subway and most of them were young people. They didn't notice the existence of Yi Liangqiu, but now they all looked over. It's Yi Liangqiu. Someone cried out, and the surroundings became even more chaotic. Qin Anlan was the first to realize it. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. Her face was buried in the crook of his arm. Other than her long hair, he couldn't see her face. There was a commotion in the surroundings. Soon, many people gathered, and each of them had little red hearts in their eyes. Qin Anlan narrowed his eyes and held Yi Liangqiu tightly in his arms. He didn't know who used their phones to record the video and broadcast it live on WeChat Moments. Qin Anlan stared coldly at that person. Not only did that person not restrain himself, he was even more arrogant. He even added his own voiceover. Heavenly Queen Yi Liangqiu is actually on the same line as us, with an unknown man. This is what that man looks like. At the end of the video, it was him, and he even made a victory sign. One person started, and the people around him started to take pictures. Yi Liangqiu's face was buried, so no one got a picture. But from the side of her face, they could tell that it was Yi Liangqiu. On the other hand, Qin Anlan was thorough in his filming. That night, the news in B City's WeChat Moments was about Yi Liangqiu's tryst with an unknown man. But it was later confirmed that the man was Qin Anlan. It became even more popular after that, because their relationship was previously dug up by the paparazzi, and there was no telling if it was real or fake. But now, they appeared in such a commoner's place and hugged each other in such an intimate manner. It could be seen that Qin Anlan loved Yi Liangqiu very much. Chapter 1679. Qin Anlan hugged her indifferently and didn't answer any questions. He only sent a message to Kaim, asking him to bring some men to protect her at a subway station. After another 10 or so stops, he held Yi Liangqiu in his arms and walked towards the entrance of the subway. Every step was difficult for him. In the end, he draped his jacket over her shoulders and covered her face. Many crazy fans followed them down the subway but were stopped by the security guards. Yi Liangqiu finally heaved a sigh of relief. She took off her jacket and revealed her face so that the fans could see her face clearly. It was indeed Yi Liangqiu. Screams rang out at the subway entrance. Yi Liangqiu waved and smiled. Then, she took the initiative to hold Qin Anlan's hand. He lowered his gaze and looked at her. After a while, he said in a low voice, "What do you mean?" "Maintaining my image." She smiled sweetly at him, looking like a delicate wife. Helpless, he took her hand and walked quickly. Yi Liangqiu followed behind him and shook the jacket in her hands. "Put it on." He turned his head and looked at her. He took it and put it on slowly. Up ahead was the place where she had entertained Ran. It was a famous place for skewers. Qin Anlan pulled her over to find a stall to sit down. The night breeze, mixed with the smoke from the barbecue, was very choking. He had just been sick, but he was sitting at the vent to block the wind for her. After a while, he was choking non-stop. His hand was covering his mouth, and his nose was red. He looked a little pathetic. Yi Liangqiu turned her head and grabbed a ball of tissue for him. She said disdainfully, stubborn. And funny. But very cute. She thought silently in her heart. Qin Anlin looked at her. After a long while, he snorted softly. Is that so? If you didn't have a wild man, why would I be so calculative with you? Yi Liangqiu was a little confused. What did he mean by a wild man? We slept in the same room when we were drunk. Do you dare to say that there was nothing between us? His fingers were slightly cold as he pinched her chin with 2 fingers. His expression didn't look too good. Yi Liangqiu looked at him in surprise and didn't know what to say. Was this considered settling scores after the fall? At that time, he didn't have such a huge reaction. Qin Anlin tightened his grip. Ha! Now, he was giving her a chance to prove herself. Only now did she realize that he wasn't jealous. He was here to settle scores and wanted her to give him an explanation. After that incident, he had slept with her, yet he was still able to endure until now to settle the score with her. He must be able to endure it. Yi Liangqiu snorted and glared at him. Qin Anlin, don't go too far. You're the one who crossed the line. He leaned close to her, his breath scorching the streets in the middle of the night. Tell me, have you ever kissed her? He knew very well what it was like to be drunk. He didn't want to think about it, didn't want to pursue it, but he couldn't let it go. This was probably a man's deep-rooted bad habit. Yi Liangqiu stared at him for a long time before she pursed her lips. After a long while, she said softly, no. Really? His gaze was sharp and focused on her face, not letting go of any expression on her face. At this moment, he looked like he was interrogating a criminal. Yi Liangqiu's gaze landed on his face. After a while, she suddenly laughed. It's fake. He tightened his grip and she cried out in pain. Ouch! But he didn't let her off. His thin lips were tightly pursed. Yi Liangqiu couldn't stand the pain and placed her hand on the back of his hand. I'm lying, I didn't. Chapter 1680. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes as he looked at her. He grabbed her hand and finally let go of her. At this moment, the boss brought the menu over. Sir and Miss, please order your meal. Coincidentally, this stall was owned by the same boss as the one who came to Ran the previous time. He had a deep impression of Yi Liangqiu. Not every 172 kilograms girl could be so good-looking. The most important thing was to have a good temperament. The boss smiled and took the menu. Miss, there's a different mister today. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and looked at Qin Anlin cautiously. Qin Anlin glared at her and then calmly ordered his meal. Without looking up, he said to the boss, there has always been only one. The one from a few days ago. He sneered. He doesn't like women. The boss was stunned. If he didn't like women, then, he liked men. But it didn't seem like it. He looked so mighty and cool. But even if he liked men, he would definitely be number 1 and definitely not number 0. With that thought, the boss felt a little better. After Qin Anlin finished ordering, he passed the menu to the boss and added 2 more bottles of beer. The boss smiled. It'll be ready in a minute. After the boss left, Yi Liangqiu looked at him. Aren't you sick? Why are you drinking beer? Did you drink when you were with Ran the other day? His voice was indifferent. Yi Liangqiu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. How can I compete with him? Are you saying that I can't compete with him? He said childishly. Yi Liangqiu deliberately made him angry. Yeah, you can't compete with him. Her gaze swept over to him. He understood. She had thought that he would be angry, but he didn't. He only glanced at her lightly and smiled. You'll know tonight whether you can compete with him or not. The boss brought the beer over. Pao opened the bottle and poured it for her, as if he was serving Empress Dowager Cixi. Yi Liangqiu took a sip and laughed. You're so sick. Behave yourself. He didn't say anything and took a sip of wine. Then, his gaze fell on the wine in front of him. After a long time, he asked softly, Yi Liangqiu, do you think you can do whatever you want now that we're not together? She stared blankly for a moment before saying softly, no. Never. Qin Anlin glanced at her and didn't say anything. He just drank quietly. She wanted to persuade him not to drink, but in the end, she didn't say anything. Instead, she finished her bottle, then took his. Qin Anlin held the cup, and his eyes were deep. Yi Liangqiu, what is this? His fingers tightened, gripping her, and she hurt. The specks of starlight from the roadside shone into her eyes, as if flowing water had flowed past her eyes. After a long time, Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. Anlin, no matter what happens between us, I hope you'll be well. He laughed coldly. Can I be well? She looked down and didn't say anything. She looked aggrieved. He was a little annoyed and wanted to vent his anger, but he held it in. He pushed all the skewers in front of her and said stiffly, eat. There was a lot of it. Yi Liangqiu looked at it and felt a little jealous, but she still ate quietly. He watched her eat. His mood was probably a little better because of her obedient look. He made an exception and peeled the prawns for her, but his voice was still tough. You're eating so fast. Aren't you afraid of swallowing? You're so dumb. Chapter 1681. This time, it was his turn to be stunned. He did not speak for a full half a minute. When he came back to his senses, his voice was hoarse. Eat. There was a touch of moisture in her eyes. I can't eat anymore. His gaze was burning. My stomach hurts. She pursed her lips. Anlin, it should be gastroenteritis. She said it calmly, but his gaze became aghast and his face was pale. Why didn't you say so earlier? His voice was so deep that it was about to drip water. He reached out to take the food from her hand and shouted at her, Yi Liangqiu, how stupid are you to drink cold beer and eat this junk food when you're sick? His tone was not good, and his expression was even worse. It could be said that he was fierce, but she felt a little warm. Because he cared about her. He had her in his heart. Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly and said in a relaxed manner, because you want to eat. Although it was relaxed, her forehead was already sweating, and her eyes were full of pain. But she, this fool, was still smiling. Qin Anlin raised his hand, and with a smack, he lightly slapped her face. He really slapped her, but it was a light slap. More than a year ago, after his mother passed away, he also slapped her, and now, he slapped her again. This time, it was because of her. Yi Liangqiu was still smiling, and there was a touch of moisture in her eyes. It was enchanting. Why aren't you leaving? His voice was even lower. Without waiting for her answer, he got up and took her hand, walking outside. Where are we going? She turned her face to look at him. Qin Anlin's voice was a little tense. To the hospital. She was about to say something, but the boss stopped them. You haven't paid yet. Really, he looked like a dog, but he actually wanted to eat and dash. Fortunately, he had good eyesight. Qin Anlin searched for a long time, but he couldn't find any cash. In the end, Yi Liangqiu gave him the money. The boss took it, counted it, and muttered, the handsome guy from last time is still the most straightforward. Miss, you have to choose carefully, especially those stingy cheapskates. You can't marry them. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Thank you, boss. No problem, no problem. The boss went back to work. Qin Anlin looked at Yi Liangqiu and glared at her. Why are you still here? She said, I don't want to go to the hospital. I thought you weren't afraid of pain. However, he grabbed her and dragged her to the road, where he hailed a taxi. Sitting in the back seat, she wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, she didn't say it directly. Anlin, I don't think we can. He didn't finish his sentence, but he understood. Qin Anlin said magnanimously, I know, I'm not as beastly as you think. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and covered her stomach. Actually, don't talk anymore. He opened his coat and carried her in, covering her stomach carefully. His chin rested on her hair, and he murmured, Liangqiu, it's my fault. I shouldn't have brought you to drink cold beer and eat that junk food. But you're always making me angry. His voice was unbelievably gentle, and she felt like she was in a dream. Was this Anlin? She thought that she was dreaming. She reached out and pinched herself. If this was a dream, then she would never wake up from it. How good would that be? Yi Liangqiu lay in his arms. His embrace was warm, and she couldn't bear to leave. Chapter 1682. Looking at how anxious he was because of her, she had never felt so content in her heart before. The emptiness of the past few days seemed to have been filled. She laid there softly, her fingers hooking onto his waist and moving down slowly, touching his chest. His anger was almost ignited by her. Just as he was about to explode, she asked softly, Anlin, if I were to die one day, would you be sad? Before he could say anything, she continued to speak with a light smile, I'm so despicable. You must hate me to the core. He wanted to say something, but her words stopped him. Hence, he said angrily, yes, I hate you to death. She did not speak again. After a while, she smiled faintly, it's what I should do. She hugged him tightly. But I'm still very happy that you're so nice to me now. Qin Anlin's heart was filled with sadness. This sadness surpassed everything else. She had always been despicable. When had she ever been so submissive? Moreover, she looked so sickly. No matter how hard his heart was, it would soften. He reached out and caressed her head. Nonsense. How would I die? He was conflicted. He could not bear to see her, but he hated her and blamed her. These emotions made him feel terrible. They snuggled up to each other in the back seat of the taxi. The taxi driver had been holding it in for a long time. He coughed lightly. Where to? Was the drama, Love in Life and Death, behind them? The male and female leads were beautiful, but from the rearview mirror, it was obvious that the male lead had fallen for it. Although the female lead had feelings, it was obvious that she was scheming. He had seen too many women say sweet nothings in order to deceive men, and each of them was more brilliant than the other. At this moment, the woman behind them was one of them. No man would be able to resist the temptation of such words of love. They would be willing to give their hearts to her. With his interruption, Yi Liangqiu said calmly, "See City General Hospital." The driver thought to himself that they had already passed C City General Hospital. Now that they were on a one-way street and there was a traffic jam, it would take about an hour to get back. However, these two did not seem to be lacking in money. Even if they were lacking in money, they would not be able to act Love in Life and Death. Let's go in circles. They were playing for romance. Slow down. Therefore, the driver obeyed the order and drove slowly. In any case, he would be paid on time. Qin Anlin didn't notice it. Just as the driver thought, he seemed to have been drugged. After more than an hour, they finally arrived at the hospital. The driver was overjoyed to receive 1,000 yuan tip. 5 minutes later, Qin Anlin looked at the department in front of him. Gynecology. Didn't she say it was gastroenteritis? Yi Liangqiu smiled. My monthly payment is here. He glared at her. It's a little painful. Give me some medicine. She was still calm. Her eyes were curved as she smiled mischievously. Qin Anlin gritted his teeth and said word by word, You said your stomach is sick. I said probably, but I didn't feel well afterward. It should be my monthly payment. She was a little rascal. Qin Anlin looked at the department in front of him. It was dark. Where was the doctor? There's no one. Forget it then. I'll go out and buy some sanitary pads. She said nonchalantly, It's an old problem anyway. She said it casually, but he did not let her go. With a cold face, he said, I'll call the doctor over to give you a good checkup. Chapter 1683. The male doctor came over and opened the door. He glanced at Yi Liangqiu. Come in. Yi Liangqiu looked at Qin Anlin and pursed her lips. I'm going in. He grabbed her hand and looked at her with a burning gaze. I'll go in with you. As he spoke, he didn't care about anything else and followed in shamelessly. The male doctor was in his early 30s. He was a rather cold doctor. After working in the gynecology department for a long time, one would develop an apathy. He looked at Yi Liangqiu. Where are you feeling unwell? Period pain, Yi Liangqiu said honestly. But what I need most now are sanitary pads. The male doctor was married and had been dragged out of his home. His temper wasn't very good, especially when he saw a beauty like Yi Liangqiu. He wasn't very tempted. He raised an eyebrow and glared at Qin Anlin. Get your husband to buy it. Yi Liangqiu glanced at Qin Anlin. He glared at her. The male doctor was displeased. What's wrong with buying some sanitary products for my wife? Yi Liangqiu looked at Qin Anlin. Her eyes were sparkling. He glared at her for a while and then walked out of the door. After a while, he turned around. Wallet. Yi Liangqiu gave it to him and watched him walk out. She didn't look too happy. After he left, the male doctor said calmly, You've taken contraceptives before, right? With your constitution, it's better not to take contraceptives, especially morning after pills. Yi Liangqiu didn't deny it. I know. Why do you still take them if you know? The doctor said coldly. Use condoms next time. It's safe and hygienic. You won't get sick easily. Yi Liangqiu secretly wondered if this male doctor wasn't being sarcastic. However, this person was quite principled. He didn't check it until Qin Anlin came back and Yi Liangqiu cleaned herself up. He repeated what he said to Qin Anlin. Qin Anlin's attitude was much better. I'll be careful. The male doctor meowed him, but didn't say anything in the end. He waved his hand to chase them away. It was almost midnight when he walked out of the hospital. The air was thin and terrifyingly cold. Standing on the deserted street, Yi Liangqiu couldn't get a cab even after trying for a long time. She was so cold that she was shivering. Ask the driver to drive over. She picked up the phone and was about to make the call, but he stopped her. He reached out to hold her hand and put the phone in his pocket. Then he took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. He buttoned her up button by button, until he reached the top one. His eyes were intent as he did all this. Yi Liangqiu breathed softly and looked at him. All right. He exhaled. Let's go. As he spoke, he held her hand and walked along the deserted street. The moonlight shone on his side profile, making him look even more handsome and alluring. His palm was warm and strong. She was reluctant but worried. "Amlin, you're the one who's sick." He continued to walk forward. "If you were worried about me, you wouldn't have said that your stomach hurt." With that said, he turned his head sideways and glanced at her. His gaze was as though he was looking at an ignorant child. Yi Liangqiu felt that she was in the wrong, so she followed beside him. After a while, she said softly, "I'll return your coat." She wanted to take it off, but her hand was held down by him. Then he placed his hand in the coat's pocket and said in a deep voice, "If you want to make trouble as much as you can." His tone was a little stern and he glanced at her. Chapter 1684. Later, she leaned on his shoulder and wrapped her arms around his waist. Just like countless old couples, they leaned on each other. "Amlin, if only we could keep going like this. How wonderful would that be? Even if I had so many expectations in my heart, even if I thought we could walk to the end, would it still be this simple, peaceful, and wonderful?" She was a little scared and buried her face in his shoulder. They walked deep into the street. After walking for about 2 hours, they stood in front of the Su mansion. He sent her home but didn't take her back. Standing face to face, he gathered her coat and smiled, "Liangqiu, this is as far as I can go." His words had a deeper meaning. She wasn't stupid, so there was no way she couldn't tell. Tomorrow is a new day. He hugged her and whispered in her ear, "I like you and admire you. You are the best lover and the best opponent." In the past, he had always underestimated her. He underestimated her ability and how cruel she could be. He was a little curious and puzzled. What kind of emotions did she have to be reluctant to part with him and then attack King Entertainment at the same time? She thought he didn't know what she had done to Xia Mian. He knew everything, including the fact that Che Taixian had slept with Xia Mian. He just felt it was a pity. Xia Mian could have had some success, if only she hadn't been so ambitious. But she had been easily killed by Yi Liangqiu. Xia Mian's incident was a trigger. And he was waiting for her to detonate it. He looked at her with a burning gaze, "Liangqiu, take care." He lifted his chin slightly, motioning for her to enter. At this moment, their parting had crushed her. She wanted to throw herself into his arms and tell him that she couldn't hold on any longer. She didn't want to go against him. The ATV wasn't important to her. He was the most important thing to her. Her lips trembled slightly. After a long time, she looked down and said, "Anlin, can we not go?" Qin Anlin looked up at the luxurious mansion in front of him. This was the place where they used to play together when they were young. But now, this house was his hatred. "Liangqiu, you should understand that I will never be able to go in." He reached out and rubbed her hair, giving her the last tenderness. "Go in. Silently waiting for you." She looked at him and suddenly felt pain in her breathing. She couldn't bear to part with him. When he turned around, he wanted to leave, but she hugged him from behind. "Amlin, are these 2 days not important to you?" She leaned against his back and rubbed her face against his back as she whispered. His body froze as he looked down at her hand. After staring at it for a long time, he smiled bitterly and said, "Liangqiu, I can't figure out which is the real you and which is the fake you. Can you still tell the difference?" She slowly loosened her grip. After a long time, she took a step back and took a deep breath of the night air. The pain in her heart pierced deep into the depths of her soul. He said that she was acting. "So, Qin Anlin, are you just playing along with my act? You said that you don't know which is real and which is fake because you don't want to believe me anymore." "Yes." She smiled lightly. "Qin Anlin, I was greedy. You're everything I wanted, but I forgot that I can't have you since a long time ago. She walked up to him and unbuttoned his coat one by one. Her fingers fondled the fabric of the coat longingly. Finally, she made up her mind and placed it in his hand. Be careful when you go back. Chapter 1685. He looked at her, at the coat in his hands, and said calmly, "You can wear it." Yi Liangqiu shook her head. No need. She stuffed it into his hands and turned to leave. She walked very quickly, but her arm was caught by him again. When she turned back, her long hair danced beautifully in the night sky. Her fair face was stunningly beautiful. He looked at her for a long time before saying softly, "I'll pick you up from King Entertainment." Actually, it would be tomorrow. She was in a daze for a moment before realizing that she had been too busy and had forgotten. After a while, she nodded. "I'll get off work at 5 tomorrow." He didn't put on his coat. Instead, he put it on his arm and turned to walk down the street. She stood on the spot and watched for a long time. Her feet were sore, and she couldn't see him anymore. The black carved door beside him slowly moved open, emitting an ear-piercing, heavy sound. Yi Liangqiu turned around slowly and saw Su Shiqing in front of the main residence. Why was he here? She adjusted her clothes and walked in. The harsh sound came from behind her again. So late. Su Shiqing coughed lightly. Looks like your relationship with Anlin has warmed up quite well. Yi Liangqiu walked inside. When she passed by Su Shiqing, she smiled coldly. As long as that day is not erased, he will never treat me the same as before. Just like how I treat him, he won't hold back when it's necessary. Yi Liangqiu's face was covered in a cold expression as he said, "So, don't hold any hopes of getting lucky." "Then stay away from him," Su Shiqing said emotionlessly. Yi Liangqiu smiled and ignored him as she walked into the main hall. It was late at night and Silent had already fallen asleep. She knew that Su Shiqing wouldn't leave easily once he came, so she was prepared to deal with him. She sat down on the sofa slowly and ordered the servants to make a cup of tea to warm her stomach. Her stomach was starting to hurt from the wind outside, but she endured it so that Su Shiqing wouldn't notice. Su Shiqing leaned on his walking stick and clasped his hands together, looking at her with a burning gaze. Because of his skinniness, his eyes were deeply sunken. In the middle of the night, he looked a little scary. Yi Liangqiu's tone was indifferent. "It's up to me whether to leave or not." Su Shiqing was about to lose his temper when she looked at him faintly. "You said he was my prize." This time, Su Shiqing's complexion improved a lot. He coldly smiled. "Yes, Qin family's people can only be prizes." He thought about it, but he was still worried, so he continued, "You have to know what's important." A servant brought the tea over. Yi Liangqiu took 2 sips and smiled faintly. "Of course." She looked at him and suddenly asked, "Is Qin Pei okay?" Su Shiqing's expression became extremely unnatural. "As usual." "Don't worry, I won't kill him and break my promise to you. As long as you put King Entertainment's income under ATV, I will let him go." "Let him go?" Yi Liangqiu really didn't know if Su Shiqing was insulting his intelligence or hers. At that time, the first thing he would do would be to kill Qin Pei and cause the fact that she and Qin Anlin would never be able to return. She knew exactly what he was thinking in his heart. Chapter 1686. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Dad managed it well in the past. Her sudden friendliness surprised Su Shiqing a little, but then he sighed slightly. "Liangqiu, no matter how unhappy we are still father and daughter. We are blood relatives in this world, and others can't compare to us. When he said this, his heart was also filled with emotion. He was already in his twilight years, and his daughter was at the peak of her career. Although she was a woman, a celebrity, from his observations these past few days, he could tell that she was very capable. She was strong enough to contend against Qin Anlin. Perhaps even when he was in his prime, she wouldn't be inferior to him. Because she was ruthless enough. Perhaps his worries were unnecessary. Yi Liangqiu just smiled and didn't say much. Su Shiqing's heart, however, was a little anxious. He didn't have much time left in his life, and he wanted to see ATV unify the industry as soon as possible. Dad is old, and my only hope is you. His voice was old, and he unconsciously showed weakness. Yi Liangqiu finally raised her eyes and looked at him with a burning gaze. Dad, I won't let you down. She was polite and respectful, and Su Shiqing's heart was quite comforted. After the sublimation of their relationship, they chatted. It's New Year's in a few days. How are you going to spend it with Momo? Before Yi Liangqiu said anything, Su Shiqing's eyes showed a touch of desire. How about I take you to Hokkaido to go skiing? Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and smiled. Anlin said he wanted the children to celebrate the New Year together. She lied without changing her expression. Because she really didn't want to be with Su Shiqing on a day like New Year's, it would only make her feel disgusted and full of hatred. She didn't want to see him, let alone celebrate the New Year together. Su Shiqing's eyes flashed with a touch of disappointment, and his old face was stiff, but after a while, he recovered and forced a smile. I see. That's good, the children have to celebrate the New Year together, and it's good for Qin Anlin to let down his guard. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything else. She swiped her phone a few times as if she was reading the news. Su Shiqing's mouth was dry, and he didn't drink any water for a long time. His heart was a little stifled, and he felt a little wronged. This was his home. At this moment, a silent cry came from upstairs, as if someone had woken up from a dream. Yi Liangqiu immediately got up, but then she sat back down, clutching her stomach. Sit down, I'll go take a look. Su Shiqing's heart was in his throat. He truly loved silence. Thus, he went upstairs with his walking stick and dismissed his bodyguard. Ah Xing, wait for me downstairs. Get the driver to be on standby. I'll leave after Silent falls asleep. His tone was still a little aggrieved. If he didn't leave, he would be hated. When she reached upstairs, Silent was indeed awake. He was crying hard, and the nanny was trying her best to coax him, but it was useless. Su Shiqing immediately went up and obediently coaxed Silent. Very soon, Silent stopped crying and giggled. She hugged Su Shiqing with her little arms and refused to let go. Su Shiqing's withered old soul bloomed like a flower. He kissed the little guy, and his expression changed. Our Silent is still the best. She's not like your mother, cold and lifeless. It's not good for Grandpa. Actually, how could he not know that Liangqiu the child resented him and hated him? Downstairs, Yi Liangqiu drank her tea slowly and didn't say anything for a long time. Chapter 1687. Yi Liangqiu glanced at him and smiled. Ah Xing, how long have you been following Mr. Su? Ah Xing was a stocky man and he was not even 30 years old. When he heard this, his square face turned red. After a while, he squeezed out a sentence. Missy, I have been following Mr. Su for 5 years. Is Mr. Su nice to you? Yi Liangqiu smiled and lowered her head to drink her tea. Then, she looked up at Ah Xing. Ah Xing was a rough man. He had never been so close to Missy, who was like a fairy. Moreover, Missy used to be a superstar, the Empress. In his heart, he had always admired her. He did not expect that one day, Missy would talk to him. Ah Xing's heart was about to float. However, he did not dare to act rashly on his face. He said honestly, not bad. I bought a house in B City and my mother came over from the countryside. Yi Liangqiu knew what was going on. She asked casually, do you have anyone in mind? This time, it was as if she had stepped on Ah Xing's tail or rubbed his heart. It was painful, numb and itchy. Fang Zhang's face turned red. He could not squeeze out a sentence for a long time. Yi Liangqiu stood up and patted his back. She smiled, don't be bored. This time, Ah Xing was really suffocating. He could only breathe in but not out. His face turned even redder, as if it was congested with blood. His breathing was hot. His gaze was burning as he looked at Missy, who was like a fairy. Yi Liangqiu smiled and sat back down. Ah Xing lost his composure. He only regained his senses after 2 minutes. He said softly, not yet. As he said this, he stole a glance at Missy, who was like a fairy. Yi Liangqiu smiled, if there is someone suitable, I will help you keep an eye out. Ah Xing's face turned red again. He thanked her softly and kept quiet. In his heart, he secretly thought that it would be great if he could have someone like the eldest miss who looked like a fairy. However, he could only think about it. For someone like the eldest miss to look at him, it was enough to make him completely satisfied. At this moment, Su Shiqing walked down the stairs slowly. He looked at Ah Xing's flushed face and said in a low voice, what happened? Ah Xing, did you make eldest miss unhappy? Ah Xing said that he dared not. Yi Liangqiu stood up and took a glance at Ah Xing. Then, she smiled and said to Su Shiqing, I was talking about introducing a girlfriend to Ah Xing. Ah Xing seems to be shy. Su Shiqing glanced sideways and looked at Ah Xing. Then, he smiled and said, I see. It's time for him to find a wife. Otherwise, he's almost 30. But if he has a wife, his legs can't be weak. Ah Xing was also a pure and crude man. How could he listen to all these? His face turned red again and he was speechless for a long time. Dad, stop teasing him. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Let me send you out. Su Shiqing's mood became better. He turned around and said, you don't have to send me out. Your body is weak. You will be fine with Ah Xing around. Ah Xing immediately expressed that he would take care and protect Mr. Su. Yi Liangqiu nodded and sent them to the door. She patted Ah Xing's arm and said, thank you for your hard work. Ah Xing suddenly felt that he was floating. He didn't know how to speak and he didn't say anything for a long time. Su Shiqing and Ah Xing sat in the car together. After driving for a while, Ah Xing was driving in front. He suddenly said, Mister, actually the eldest miss is very concerned about you. Chapter 1688. Su Shiqing was no longer the same as before. Even if a bodyguard were to speak to him, he would feel that it was a form of solitude. However, Ah Xing was not a talkative person in the past. Why was he behaving like this today? Su Shiqing's eyes were old but sharp. Why did you say good things about her? Ah Xing was driving and his forehead was covered in sweat. He stole a glance at the rearview mirror and said hurriedly, Elder Miss is a nice person. Su Shiqing closed his eyes again. Liangqiu is not mean to her servants. Ah Xing relaxed his body and he was extremely nervous. He had such thoughts about Elder Miss and he did not dare to let Mr. Su find out about it. Otherwise, he would not be able to live. He asked discreetly, Sir, what's going on between Miss Qin and Mr. Qin? Although Ah Xing was following Su Shiqing, he was innocent. He did not know about Su Shirqing's dark side. Just as he finished his question, Su Shirqing's gaze suddenly turned dangerous. "Ah, Xing, there are some things that you shouldn't ask about. I like that you are steady and quiet. That's why I kept you by my side. Don't let me down." Ah Xing did not dare to speak anymore and focused on driving. However, Yi Liangqiu's face kept flashing in his mind. After that, he followed Su Shirqing back and laid down in his single room. Whenever he closed his eyes, he would think of Elder Miss who was like a fairy. Then, that night, Ah Xing's dream passed out. When he woke up, he was in a sorry state. He was panting heavily and his hair was drenched in sweat. The darkness covered his sorry state. However, it also felt like there was an invisible hand that could reach out from the dark and choke his lifeline. He felt that his breathing was not smooth. Whenever he thought of Elder Miss, his body would hurt again. Ah Xing was still a virgin and had never done anything between a man and a woman. Once that happened, it was out of control. He lowered his head and looked for a long time. Finally, he went to the bathroom and turned on the water. Based on his instinct, he did something bad for the first time. His mind was filled with Elder Miss who was like a fairy. In the end, he only muttered Elder Miss's name. After everything was over, there was only emptiness. The water was cold, and the air was cold. Ah Xing's body leaned against the wall and slid down slowly. In the end, he used his hands to cover his face and rubbed it vigorously. Late at night, at the Su mansion, Yi Liangqiu held a glass of wine in her hand and swirled it gently. It had been more than a year, and she hadn't been able to find Qin Pei. If she found Qin Pei, she would immediately kill Su Shirqing. Those sins vanished into thin air. She had never thought of letting Anlan know about those things. However, she had not been able to find a breakthrough until today, when she saw Ah Xing sneaking a glance at her. She admitted that she was despicable. She made use of Ah Xing, or she would make use of him in the future. She made use of his lust or his admiration for her. Perhaps, if Ah Xing worked for her, he would eventually die, but she would still do it. Perhaps, if she had Su Shirqing's blood in her. She was the same as him, equally unscrupulous. Just now, Silent cried because she asked the nanny to do it. Su Shirqing loved Silent, so he went up and gave her the chance to tease Ah Xing. She slowly took a sip of the red wine, and a glint flashed across her long and beautiful eyes. Chapter 1689. Every year, King Entertainment's end-of-year party was extremely grand. It was held in GM's largest ballroom. When Yi Liangqiu arrived, Keim picked her up in the car. He said that Qin Anlan couldn't get away, but he had sent his trusted aide. This was enough to show how much he valued her. However, Yi Liangqiu soon realized that this was just wishful thinking on her part. If everything that had happened before was all about her scheming against Qin Anlan, then from now on, it was Qin Anlan's counterattack. Or rather, this finale was an elaborate scheme he had set up for her. At least, Yi Liangqiu stood on the red carpet and looked at Qin Anlan and Xia Mian standing side by side in the distance, like a golden couple. She smiled bitterly. Only then did she understand what he had said last night. He had really declared war on her, and she was still trapped in his gentleness. She was too naive. Xia Mian was wearing a light purple striped skirt tonight, revealing her deep cleavage. She was fair and looked like she was made of money. She wore a very expensive diamond necklace around her neck. Xia Mian couldn't afford it herself, so the only possibility was Qin Anlan. Her eyes fell on Qin Anlan's face. She smiled faintly, and there was a hint of mockery in her smile. Then, she reached out and grabbed Keim. Keim was startled. He leaned against Yi Liangqiu and smiled bitterly, posing for the reporters to take pictures. His back was cold. He could already feel President Chin's gaze stabbing at him like two knives. He smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, "Mr. Yi, it's about time. I'm afraid I won't live to see the sun tomorrow." After a pause, he said, "I'm still alive to wait for my child's mother." Yi Liangqiu smiled and said in a low voice, "Then we'll cooperate. Don't worry, you won't die. At most, you'll have your hands and feet broken." In fact, they all knew how much Qin Anlin cared about her. However, the person he wanted to deal with wasn't her, but ATV. Tonight, he was obviously trying to embarrass her and the ATV. What he was doing was giving him a taste of his own medicine. When Yi Liangqiu was almost done with the photos, she walked in the direction of Qin Anlin. In the fierce evening wind, she felt like she had walked for a century on that 10-meter-long carpet. "Anlin, you're here. But even though I'm getting closer, I feel like I'm getting further and further away." Finally, she walked to his side and linked her arm with Kime's. Kime felt so innocent. He put on a bitter face and didn't dare to look at Qin Anlin's face. Qin Anlin and Xia Mian stood side by side as if they were being interviewed. However, Yi Liangqiu knew that he was waiting for her to come over so that he could give her a fatal blow. She smiled. "It seems that I'm not President Qin's dance partner tonight." Qin Anlin looked away from the reporters and directly at Yi Liangqiu's arm, which was holding Kime's arm. His gaze was so intense that it could burn a hole through Kime's arm. Kime coughed lightly and tried to retract his arm, but he didn't. Qin Anlin's gaze finally shifted to Yi Liangqiu's face. He smiled faintly. "Yes, Xia Mian, as a rising star of King Entertainment, will be my dance partner tonight." Yi Liangqiu nodded and still had a smile on her face. "President Qin is quite creative." She looked at Kime, who immediately waved her hand. "Mr. Yi, I'm very busy tonight. I might not have time to be your dance partner." "I see." She looked at Qin Anlin and smiled. "Then I'll call Ran over. He hasn't left yet." Chapter 1690. "Yes." She smiled relaxedly. "But President Qin forgot that if it weren't for our personal relationship, I wouldn't have had to attend the party, and I wouldn't have been insulted by President Qin for no reason." She looked straight at him. "President Qin, don't forget that our honor and disgrace are one. Too many scandals won't do you any good." He pondered for a moment. "For example, Che Taixian CD." His voice was a little low, and Yi Liangqiu's eyes turned cold. So he knew. Xia Mian's blood froze. Che Taixian. What was the relationship between Yi Liangqiu and Che Taixian? Could it be that sleeping with her was a conspiracy? And the mastermind was Yi Liangqiu? Xia Mian's face turned pale, and she stared straight at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu quickly recovered from the shock. She looked at Xia Mian and smiled. "Miss Xia, didn't you pay attention to your facial expression? It won't look good if the reporters take photos of you like this." Xia Mian was stunned for a moment, and then she immediately put on a sweet expression, but her eyes still looked as if she wanted to eat Yi Liangqiu up. Qin Anlin stretched out his hand. "Let's go." His arm was in front of them, and there were two women in front of them. Yi Liangqiu wouldn't think that he was talking to her, but it was ridiculous to say it to Xia Mian. Wasn't he tired of playing such a clumsy trick all the time? Xia Mian also hesitated for a moment, and then she carefully put her hand in Qin Anlin's arm. He didn't object. Her heart slowly rose with a touch of joy. He didn't break free, which meant that his female companion was really her, not Yi Liangqiu. No matter what the reason was, the person standing in front of President Qin was her. Xia Mian couldn't believe it, and she was overconfident. Then she showed a victorious smile to Yi Liangqiu. There was a hint of provocation in her eyes. So what if Yi Liangqiu was Mrs. Qin? President Qin had just slapped her in the face. The centennial scene was captured by the reporters. Compared to Xia Mian's complacency, Yi Liangqiu stood aside, looking a bit depressed. In her heart, she knew that Qin Anlin would not just show off for no reason. He must have something more important to announce to the reporters. If there was no mistake, it was to formally announce the plan to acquire ATV. She pursed her lips tightly. Her fingers were clenched into fists, and her insides were already dripping with sweat. Sure enough, Qin Anlin faced the media and smiled calmly, his tone calm. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I also thank ATV's chairman Yi for coming to King Entertainment's Tail Teeth. However, I still regret to announce that King Entertainment will carry out a comprehensive acquisition plan for ATV after the new year. The entertainment reporters were in an uproar. A few days ago, President Qin was still showing off his love in a high-profile manner. Now, he was holding Xia Mian's hand, openly declaring war against his own wife. So their love from before was all fake. The entertainment reporters weren't too interested in the business world. They were more interested in President Qin's true feelings. Did he really have an affair with a second-tier actress, and then abandon the Queen Yi Liangqiu? As they frantically asked questions, Qin Anlin only smiled and didn't answer. This was where his brilliance came from. This scene was embarrassing enough for Yi Liangqiu. At this moment, she realized that when necessary, he could be ruthless. Kaim, who was standing to the side, secretly broke out in a cold sweat. Mr. Ye's expression was really ugly. And President Qin, if she went too far, what if Mr. Yi took things too hard and really made him a cuckold? It would be too late for regrets. Yi Liangqiu took a deep breath and said in a very low voice, Kaim, catch me when I fall to the ground later. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.